Well, today we are in week 2 of our prayer initiative. Last week we began with the overarching topic of adoration. And last week we looked at Luke chapter 7, verses 36 through 50, and we read about an encounter that a sinful woman had with Jesus. When she heard that he was in town, she ran to him at a dinner that he was at a Pharisee's home. And she washed Jesus' feet that day with her tears as the water and her hair as the rags. And then she anointed his feet with perfume. And last week we talked about this as being an expression of adoration, an expression of deep love, deep respect for somebody, that personal relationship and ultimately the life we have through Jesus was shown through this woman. This week's topic is awareness. And awareness means to have knowledge or perception of someone or something. Today we're going to look at someone who was very aware of God in their life. So in doing so, would you please turn in your Bibles to Psalm chapter 139. This week is awareness. And my hope is that we as a church, we as a people can just be a little bit more aware of God in our lives. And so I want to ask you, as you're turning there, how aware are you of God in your life? Because if you don't know this, God is here right now, today, in this moment we have. He will be here with us as we leave the church today. He is with us always. But sometimes we're just not aware of it. Sometimes we miss it. I hope today can just be a day where we sit in God's word and our eyes can be opened just a little bit wider. Before we read, I just want to go over a few things about this psalm. The first is that the psalm is written by David, King David. He was a man who loved God. He was a very passionate man for the Lord. And he, too, had some weak moments, but there were a lot of moments in his life from a very young age to a very old age that he loved God, he trusted God. This psalm has an overarching theme of the presence of God. This psalm can also be broken into 4 parts, which is how we will break it up today. The first part is focusing on God being all-knowing. The second is God being omnipresent, and the third is that God is being the creator. The last part that we'll read today, David just begins to share his heart for God. This psalm shows a lot of surrender. This psalm shows a lot of what it means to be aware of God. And so my hope is that we can just learn a little bit today together. With that being said, if you would read with me, Psalm chapter 139, I'm going to start in verse 1. David writes this: "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all of my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. If only you, God, would slay the wicked. Away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are in rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. So there's a lot here. David just goes on and just expresses his heart. And so we're going to try to walk through this psalm together. And the beautiful thing about God's word is that every time you go to God's word, you can learn something new. Whether it be something brand new or something you heard a long time ago that seeds were planted, whatever it may be, every time we go to God's word, there's something to grasp. So will we talk about every little detail and understand this psalm completely? No. But the beautiful thing is that I hope that we can just grab something from today, and that when we go back to this time in and time out, we can learn new things and grow constantly. So we start here in verses 1 through 6, when David points to God being all-knowing. So in these first three parts, David will say this statement, this overarching statement, and then begin to go into detail about how or why this would be true. Here we see some points that David makes about God being all-knowing. David writes that God knows his most inner thoughts. It's the ones that no one else hears. It's the thoughts that come to your mind, and then you think about it before you say it, and then you don't say it. Or you think about it before you say it, and then you still say it. God knows David's thoughts well before he ever would say them. David writes that God knows everything he does, from waking up to going to bed, where he wakes up and where he'll lie his head. God knows where he's going to wake up and lie his head. God knows every little thing that David is going to do that specific day, everything that he's going to say. It even goes into detail of how God knows the words before David even says them. Before he can even think them, God already knows. Because what David is expressing here is that God is all-knowing and that God truly knows David's heart. Because that's where it comes from, right? Yes, it comes from our mind, but I believe there's a sense of our words reflect, the tongue reflects the heart. So the words that come out of our mouths truly come from the heart. So what David is getting here is that God knows all, and he knows David's heart. He knows all around David, and he knows David specifically. And then David gets into more detail and makes it personal. David says that God is familiar with all of his ways. You know, there's one sense that we could read this and listen to this and be like, oh, wow, God is all-knowing because, like, God's here and we're here. And yes, that's very true. But there's also a sense that God came down to save us, right? There's also that sense that God has this deep love for us, that he would send his son to us. There's that sense of that personal relationship. And David understood that relationship well before Jesus ever came. Here we see that David is expressing that God is familiar with him. There's not this distance between God and David. David and God are here. David knows that God is connected with him, that he knows every little thing, and he cares about every little thing. It's not that just he knows and he's distant. He's like, yeah, I know what you're going to say, David. But he's invested into David's life, and David is expressing that by sharing that he's familiar with all the ways. It's not that he just knows them, but he's familiar with them. There's that relational aspect that David is already hinting at, that he'll go and explain more throughout this psalm. Which brings us to the next part of this psalm, verses 7 through 13, where David then begins to talk about God's omnipresence. Now, some of you may have heard me use this word before, and it won't be surprising to you. Others of you may not know this, but I don't word very well. In fact, even my own family now makes a running joke after church at lunch, where if I make a big word, say a big word at announcements, or I use a big word in my sermon, we're like, wow, Ty, I can't believe you said that this week. And I'm like, yeah, I know, me either. The students always call out whenever I use a big word, and then they'll even question me if I actually know the definition of that word. Because sometimes you just say things without realizing what they mean, right? Because sometimes you just say it and you don't even think about it, but God still knows those words too. But back to what I was saying. So omnipresence is one of those big words, those churchy words. And what omnipresence means is that God is present everywhere. All places, all at once. Omnipresence, God is present everywhere. He is present everywhere, and he is always present. That there is nowhere that you can go, there is nowhere that David could go that God would not be. And again, David then expresses and has points to make in this general statement. So these are the things that he says. He goes into such detail to talk about how if he would climb to the highest of highs in heaven, or go into the deepest, darkest depths of the world, God would be there. So the highest of highs, the lowest of lows, God is there. As far as the east can touch the west, and going all the way left and going all the way right, God is there. David is expressing how there is nowhere he could go that God will not be there. Then David uses this point of talking about darkness, of how even in the darkness it is light to God. Even in the darkest places, God can see. Have you ever been in a room where you shut off all the lights and you don't have in that room one of those like emergency lights or a night light, and it's like pitch black, and then it's either nighttime or you just don't have windows in that room for whatever reason, and like you just cannot see. I remember when I was a kid, we lived in this house that was up on a hill, and that when winter came like this, you just didn't see us for a few weeks. And in the basement, it was just like this storm cellar type of basement. And one time, my siblings and I were downstairs, and we were great to one another. We brought my parents and Nana just the most stress in life. And so one of the great moments we did was one of my siblings, I don't remember who, shut off the lights when I was downstairs in the basement, and then ran up and then shut the door. So it was pitch black, and I'm yelling, and no one's hearing me. And I feel like I know, like, you ever feel like you know a room pretty well, right? Like, you're like, oh yeah, I know this room like the back of my hand, right? No? Okay. Maybe some of you should be studying up the schematics of your homes, okay? Because there might be a moment when you get the light shut off and you got to figure it out. But to my point, I thought I knew the basement pretty well. It was pretty empty back then. There were a few support beams to hold up the house, but other than that, I thought I was pretty good. So I thought that I could get to the stairs, climb up the stairs, and then seek revenge, this was well before Jesus, on my siblings for shutting me in the basement in the dark, okay? I wanted the eye for the eye well before the Lord showed me what turning the other cheek was. But so I was trying to figure out and get there, but I started going in one direction, and then I got a little confused. I thought I was going the wrong direction, so I'd turn around, and then really, I didn't even know if I was turning around because it was pitch black. And I just kept going in circles and circles that I found out because when someone actually turned on the lights, I barely moved. Like, I thought I was going somewhere, and I went nowhere. I was completely hidden. You wouldn't have seen me. It's like those moments when all the lights are out, and then someone jumps out at you, and you're in that fight or flight mode. Some of you are in a fall mode, where instead of fighting and swinging or yelling, you just fall over, and that's okay too. You're hidden in the dark, right? Like, you can't see, they can't see, it's very clear. But God sees through the darkness. That's what David's saying right here. And we can talk about a literal physical darkness, but I think David may also be hinting here at sin. Because sin brings this veil of darkness, this mess, that we become unrecognizable, that we become so lost and so blind. But God sees through that sin. God sees through that shame and that mess and those chains, and he sees us. He sees David, and David knows that. Think about it. Think back to the garden. When Adam and Eve were deceived and they ate the fruit, what was the thing that they did? They hid. They hid from God because they had shame. This deep shame. Have you ever experienced such a deep shame of something that you feel like you can't just not do, that you're stuck in, or that you did one time and you're like, oh man, like I feel awful because of this? That's how Adam and Eve felt after eating from the fruit and realizing they were naked and tons of different things are going on. So they felt this shame and this guilt, and then they heard God coming, and so they tried to hide. Obviously, God knew where they were in the garden because he saw through everything else. And that's what David is saying here, that there is nothing, nowhere that we could go, or nowhere what David could do that God would not see him and be there. Now, David has a lot of history and life and amazing things. He truly did live some of the highest of highs from a very young age. We might all know the story of David Goliath. It's taught since we were very young in church. But then there's a lot of things that David does that are not great. There's a lot of moments of weakness, but God sees through that all. And there's redemption and restoration. There is no end to God's domain simply because he created it all. Which brings us to the third part, verses 13 through 18, when David then begins to talk about how God crafted us. He specifically begins to talk about how God created him. God talks about how he was formed and created in his mother's womb. How that God knew him in the very deepest, darkest depths before he could ever be born. How God knew all of the days before David even began to have those days. Think about that. That God knew David before David was ever conceived, before David ever drew his own breath. Life is so crazy, and I don't think we think about it, right? Like think of birth for a second. Hear me out, okay? I just had a baby, and when Hayden drew her first breath, when she gasped for the very first time, when she began to snort uncontrollably because she's just like her dad, God already knew that she was going to draw that breath. Some of you I have told this to, but now having children up to the toddler age, as a parent, I've only gotten so far in my experience, but parents, maybe you can agree with me. There's just a crazy thing of life, right? Like from the moment you find out that you're pregnant and that you have this little not even the size of a peanut, but smaller. And then through the next 9+ months, this little baby just continues to grow until this beautiful real child. And then they kind of look like an alien at birth, and they kind of don't sometimes. Sometimes they're really chunky, and sometimes they're really not chunky. But then afterwards, right, there's still growth. And hear me out. Just follow me along with this. Because God did all of this. God created all of this, okay? There's levels there of growth from a baby to a toddler. I've learned that much, okay? So it starts with the baby that doesn't look like the Gerber baby, okay? Like that freshly born baby that kind of just looks at you and isn't actually looking at you. Then you get to those 9-month age where it's like the Gerber baby where they're moving and they're smiling and they're cooing and maybe they're doing other things. right? And then they hit another growth spurt, and then they turn into a baby toddler, okay? It's baby dash toddler. It's where they're still a baby, but they're starting to like grow to the size of a toddler. The twins right now, I keep saying they look like, if you ever seen the movie Elf, I know Christmas is over, but this is the best description of it. Like Hayden looks like an elf baby, and the twins look like Buddy the elf as a baby, like just 10 times the size, right? That's the baby toddler. And then you get toddler baby, where like they're a toddler, right? But they still have that baby face. And then they hit another growth spurt where they become a toddler, and then you're like, oh my goodness, like soon you're gonna, get a job or something, and then I don't know what's next, okay? That's as far as I've gotten so far. So help me out and let me know what happens next. But so there's just these different levels of growth, and I'm so perplexed by this, so amazed by this. Yes, because I'm living in the trenches of it right now, and some parents are like, just you wait. But let's just pause for a second and just try to wrap our minds around like our life and children's lives and just creation. Like God knew all of us in our mother's wombs. Regardless of your story, regardless of how you got here today, God knew you. He created you. David goes into detail saying that in the innermost places, there was detail being shaped and molded. Human beings are fearfully and wonderfully made. And then David ends this part by talking about how God's thoughts outnumber the grains of sand. Like, just think about that. That's just another thing that we read sometimes that we skip right over. But we live in Erie. So think of the beach, our version of the beach. Think of Presque Isle or the peninsula, whichever one you call it. Think of all the sand at all the different spots. But that's just not the only place of grains of sand. Think about all the sand that's below the shoreline. Think about the places all around this earth that are covered in dirt and sand, not just pavement and grass. There is so many grains of sand all around us, all around this world, and God's thoughts outnumber them. David couldn't wrap his mind around it. Every time he begins to share about these different aspects of God, he just becomes lost. Because that's how great our God is. He talks about in this one, in this part, and the last part of how God's hand is upon him. That familiarity, that relationship once again. And then we get to the last part, the last couple of verses, 19 through 24. David expresses his zeal for God. Zeal is one of those other church words, I think it's a church word, and it means great energy or enthusiasm. Like it's that real hype guy, right? It's like the super fans, super fan. It puts all of the super fans to shame because it's not about just being a fan. It's going well beyond a fan. It's deep enthusiasm and energy. That's what David is expressing as he's writing all of this. And that's what David begins to put personally. He begins to share his frustrations with everyone who speaks against God. Now, he's not just talking, I don't think David here is writing about the people that are lost. He specifically talks about the enemies of God, those who speak against God, those who have intent against God. That's who David burns with anger against. He's so frustrated in it. He's so exhausted in it, and that's where he ends by saying, God, search my heart, because you know everything. And I know that you love me, so search me. Here's that place of surrender again. This psalm, I believe, is a beautifully written expression of a heart after God and such great awareness of who God is. David fully is self-aware of his own heart, and he's as aware as he could be of God's heart. But this psalm was not just written in a way that David could express his feelings, and all of these things only apply to David. This also applies to us today. Think about it. God knows your life completely. There's nothing that you can hide from him. There's nowhere that you can go that he won't be there. Sometimes we get in this thought process that when we leave church that God... So sorry. Sometimes we get this thought process that when we leave church that God stays here because this is God's house. Yes, it's true that this is the Lord's house, but God goes with you. He is with us always, no matter where you go. And let's add one level to it, no matter what you do. Because the enemy is going to talk about where you're at and what you're doing and how distant you are and how shameful you should feel and start throwing more weight of that shame and those chains back around you. But here David expresses that God sees him through it all. And you need to know today that no matter where you're at or what you're doing, God sees you and he loves you. And that is why he sent Jesus to die for you. You need to become aware of that no matter how hard it gets. No matter how hard it was, it is, or it will be, God is there in it. Because he is omnipresent and he knows all things. He knows you completely. You were once unable to provide for yourself. Unable to breathe without the assistance. Unable to do anything, yet God already knew your name. He knew the numbers on the hair on your head, and he loved you. His thoughts outnumber the grains of sand. Think about that. And this zeal for God that David expresses isn't just something that we can read about and go, oh wow, what if? But no, it's something that we can have as well. Zeal, I believe, comes from a place of being aware of God and knowing God and following God. In this psalm, I think we can see two practical examples of becoming more aware of God in our life by invitation and reflection. Invitation, we can read in the beginning of the psalm and at the end of the psalm, David talks about how God has searched his heart, and then he invites God to search his heart. And I got to tell you, when you invite God in, a lot of things can happen. There's moments where it's like a subtle thing of like the, oh wow, like the aha moments. And then there's like those crashing moments where like you just get hit in the feels. And like you might start expressing your feelings and you might start seeing things in a different way that you can't unsee. It's kind of like on that hot summer day when you're either at the lake or in a pool and there's pool noodles around and you hear it crack off of the water, right? That crack and that smack is like when you get hit in those feels and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't unsee it. And sometimes, by raise of hands maybe, some of us have been on the other side of those feelings, right? Of when you get smacked with a pool noodle. No? Okay, that's fine. I have been on both the giving and receiving end as a teenage boy and sometimes as a grown man. But when you invite God in, whether it's a small and just little voice, or it's that booming, cracking, smacking voice, God will speak. He will open your eyes to become more aware of his presence. And the second is reflection. This psalm is all about reflection. David just took time just to sit and reflect about how God is all-knowing. Why did he reflect that? Because he looked back in his own life. He could talk about how God was omnipresent or is omnipresent. How? Why? Because he looked back in his own life and saw where God was every little way. He could know that he was fearfully and wonderfully made because he looks back in his own life. He reflects. We are in a time right now, church, When one year ends and the next year begins, it's all about reflecting and looking ahead. What a perfect time of the year to just stop where you're at and reflect and say, God, where have you been in my life? And not just say it and move on, but just to sit and to look. I promise you, God has been there. Maybe he's been a little bit farther away than you would like, not because he doesn't care about you, but because you haven't invited him in. Church, we don't have to wait to become more aware of God in our life. We can start today. Whether this is your first time here or you've been coming here longer than you can remember, we all can become more aware of God in our life.